The station was enormous. It floated in the dark between three star systems, lit up like a small city, full of ships coming and going at all hours. Vareth Prime was the center of everything the Galactic Accord had built over 4,000 years. Trade happened here, wars were stopped here. Deals were made in its long corridors and wide council chambers, between species that had been traveling the stars long before humanity had figured out fire. Nobody paid much attention when the human ship docked. It was a small vessel by galactic standards. Clean lines, no heavy weapons on the hull, no battle markings. The Kethar docking officer who processed the arrival barely looked up from his console. Humans had been members of the Accord for 11 years. They had one colony outside their home system. They had a small fleet, a modest military, and a reputation for being polite and a little too confident for a species their age. The docking officer stamped the clearance and moved on to the next ship. Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Gale stepped off the ship and looked around. He was not a large man. Average height, lean build, with short brown hair and calm gray eyes that moved slowly across the docking bay, taking everything in without any rush. He wore a dark service uniform with no medals on the chest. Behind him came 23 others, soldiers, all of them, dressed the same way, carrying light packs, talking quietly among themselves. They looked relaxed. A few of them were smiling. A Kethar military liaison named Voss was waiting near the bay entrance. Voss was tall, nearly 3 meters, with pale blue skin and 4 arms folded across his wide chest. When he had served in the Accord's combined defense forces for over 200 years. He had met the representatives of 61 species at this station. He considered himself very difficult to surprise. He looked at the humans and said nothing for a moment. Then he stepped forward and greeted Aaron with the standard Accord salute. One hand raised, palm open. Aaron returned it without hesitation, then shook Voss's hand in the human way. Voss accepted this because he had read that humans did it as a sign of respect, though he found the gesture strange. They walked together through the station's wide main corridor, past shops and offices and aliens of a dozen different shapes going about their business. Voss explained the schedule. There would be a formal welcome session the next morning. The Aaron's team would be assigned quarters on level 7. The Accord Council wanted to discuss humanity's role in the combined defense structure during the week's summit. Aaron listened and nodded. He asked a few questions, practical ones, about communication channels and emergency protocols. Voss answered them and then asked his own question. He asked what role humanity's soldiers were meant to play, exactly. The Accord already had the Kethar heavy fleets, the Palindri long-range strike groups, the Drevath ground armies. Humanity's military was small. What did they bring that was not already covered? Aaron thought about it for a second. He said, "We're the ones you call when nothing else works." Voss looked at him. He could not tell if the human was joking or not. Aaron's face gave nothing away. Voss decided to let it go and moved on to the next item on the schedule. What Voss did not know, what almost no one at Vareth Prime knew at that moment, was that 3 days earlier, a report had come in from the Outer Rim. A mercenary coalition called the Shreth Dominion had moved into the Kelvrath Corridor, a stretch of 6 star systems that sat along a critical supply route. The Dominion's forces were large, well-armed, and completely uninterested in negotiation. They had destroyed 2 Accord monitoring stations and were pushing deeper into the corridor with every passing hour. The Accord's response had been fast. A Kethar battle group, 12 warships, the finest in the combined fleet, had moved to intercept. It was the kind of force that had ended conflicts in days before. And the Kethar had not lost a major engagement in over 1,000 years. Their ships were old and powerful, built on technology so refined that most species could only study it from a distance. The Shreth Dominion had stopped them cold. Nobody at Vareth Prime was saying it out loud yet, but the battle group had pulled back with heavy damage. The Dominion had not slowed down. If anything, they had sped up. Aaron did not know this yet either, not officially. But one of his team, a quiet, sharp woman named Dana Holloway, who had a habit of listening to everything while appearing to listen to nothing, had picked up enough from corridor conversations and half-heard radio traffic during their arrival to put a rough picture together. She told Aaron about it that evening in their quarters on level 7. When speaking in a low voice while the rest of the team unpacked and settled in, Aaron sat on the edge of a bunk and listened. When she finished, he asked if she was sure. She said she was pretty sure. He nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway. Then he said they would wait and see what the morning brought. The morning brought Dravel. The Kethar admiral arrived at Varath Prime before dawn, aboard a command ship that docked in the station's military bay with very little announcement. He was old, even by Kethar standards, with deep gray skin marked by the faint geometric patterns that indicated rank and age in his culture. He had fought in wars that started before humanity reached the moon. He had commanded fleets at battles that were now taught in every military academy in the known galaxy. He went directly to the war room on level 2 and spent 3 hours reviewing the Kelvrath situation with the Accord's Senior Defense Council. What they told him confirmed what the Accord had been trying not to say out loud. The Dominion had adapted quickly to Kethar tactics. They had studied the fleet's movements and found its gaps. A second assault, using the same approach, would likely fail the same way. The Council argued about options. More ships, different formations, a diplomatic channel through a neutral party. Dravel listened to all of it and said very little. Then one of the younger analysts, a palindri named Yeva, who handled intelligence files, put a single line on the table. She said there was one option they had not discussed. She said the Accord had a new member species whose military history suggested a very different approach to exactly this kind of problem. Dravel asked which species. Yeva said, humans. Silence followed, not a dismissive silence, something more careful than that. Dravel looked at the wall map showing the Kelvrath corridor, the Dominion's position, the Accord's damaged fleet sitting at the edge of the system. He asked how soon the human team could be briefed. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. Whatever confidence had filled the room before was sitting a little lower now, and everyone around the table could feel it. Something was coming that their ships and their history had not prepared them for, and they all knew it, even if they could not name it yet. Dravel stood, straightened his uniform, and said to contact the humans. On level 7, Sir Aaron's comm unit buzzed once. He looked at the message, set his coffee down, and walked to the door of Dana's room and knocked. She opened it immediately. She was already dressed. He said, "It's time." She grabbed her jacket and followed him down the corridor without another word. Behind them, one by one, lights came on under the other doors. The rest of the team heard them moving and got up without being told. That was the thing about these particular humans. They did not need to be told twice. They did not need to be told at all, most of the time. They moved like people who had already decided, long before any order arrived, that they were going to do whatever needed to be done. Out in the corridor, the station hummed quietly around them, full of a galaxy that had no idea what it had just asked for. Yeva had reviewed the military histories of 42 civilizations in her career. She was good at it. She could sit down with a stack of intelligence files on any species, read through their wars and their weapons and their strategies, and have a clear picture in her head by the end of the day. She was fast, thorough, and almost nothing surprised her anymore. She started reading the human files on a Tuesday morning. She was still reading on Thursday afternoon. It was not that the files were long, though they were longer than most. It was that every time she thought she understood the pattern changed. Every time she found a limit, the next file showed humans walking past it. She would read about a catastrophic loss, a battle where human forces were surrounded, you outnumbered, out of supplies, cut off from any help. and she would expect the next entry to record a surrender or a collapse. Instead, the next entry would describe how those same forces had kept fighting. Not because they had found new supplies or new weapons, simply because they had decided to. She flagged this pattern on the first day, but told herself it was an outlier. She kept reading. By the second day, she had stopped telling herself that. She pulled out a file on a conflict called the Second World War, fought on their home planet centuries before humans reached the stars. The scale of it was hard to process. Dozens of nations, hundreds of millions of soldiers, every kind of terrain the planet had. Deserts, frozen plains, thick forests, small islands in the middle of open ocean. It went on for 6 years. And the casualties were enormous, and the whole time humans on every side of the conflict kept going, kept building, kept adapting. She read about soldiers who survived conditions that would have shut down the biology of most known species within days, and who came out the other side and went straight back into the fight. She sat back in her chair and looked at the wall for a while. Then she pulled a file on something the humans called Special Forces. She had seen the term flagged in several of the earlier reports, but had not stopped to examine it closely. Now she did. Special Forces were not ordinary soldiers. Even by human standards, which were already unusual, they were something separate. They went through a process called selection that was designed not so much to find strong people as to find people who would not stop. And the training was long and brutal. Most humans who attempted it failed. Not because they lacked strength or intelligence, but because at some point during the process, the part of a person that says this is too much would speak up. And for most people, even very capable people, that voice eventually won. For the ones who passed, it never did. Yeva read through the documented capabilities: long-range infiltration behind enemy lines, surviving in hostile environments with almost no equipment, disrupting enemy operations not through direct force, but through precision, taking apart the structure of an enemy's ability to fight before the enemy even knew they were under attack. Working in very small groups, moving fast, hitting targets that a larger force could never reach, and disappearing before a response could be organized. She read a case study from a conflict called the Vietnam War. A small team of 8 humans had been operating in a jungle environment for 11 days, deep inside hostile territory, with no resupply. They had disrupted 3 separate enemy operations, neutralized 2 command posts, and walked out of the jungle on their own 2 feet when it was done. The environment alone, heat, disease, hostile wildlife, terrain that made movement extremely slow, would have ended the operation for most species within the first 48 hours. The 8 humans had treated it as ordinary. She kept reading. She found documentation of a training program where sleep deprivation was used as a baseline condition, not a stress test, where soldiers were expected to solve complex navigation and tactical problems after 3 days without rest, where the standard response to an injury, if the injury was not immediately life-threatening, was to keep going, where soldiers who asked to stop were not punished. They were simply removed from the program, and the ones who remained were the ones who had not asked. Yeva set the files down and got up and walked to the small window in her office. Outside, the stars were steady and still. A Kethar cargo ship was moving slowly past the station, enormous and ancient, carrying goods between systems the way it had for centuries. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. She thought about what she had just spent 2 days reading. She went back to her desk and pulled the file on human military losses. Wars where they had been defeated, occupied, pushed back. She wanted to understand how they lost, because that felt important. Now, what she found was that even in defeat, humans almost never fully stopped. Occupied nations formed underground movements, defeated armies reorganized, populations under oppression found slow, quiet ways to resist for years, sometimes decades, until the conditions changed enough to allow something more. The historical record of human civilization was not the story of a species that won all its battles. It was the story of a species that kept showing up to the next one. She compiled everything into a report for Dravel and sent it over. Then she went down to the docking level. She was not sure why, exactly. Curiosity, maybe. She wanted to see the humans before they went into the briefing. She stood near a connecting corridor and watched them as they walked toward the war room. Aaron at the front, Dana a step behind him, and the others moving in a loose group. They were talking. A couple of them were laughing at something. They had the relaxed, easy manner of people who were on their way to do a job they had done before and were not particularly worried about. One of them, a stocky, broad-shouldered man named Pete Navarro, noticed Yeva watching and gave her a small nod and a brief smile. Not a performative smile. Just the automatic, casual kind that humans seem to produce the way other species breathed. Yeva nodded back. When they had passed, she stayed where she was for another moment. She thought about the files. She thought about the photograph she had found near the end of the last document. A small, old image of a human unit standing in mud and rain at the edge of some jungle, exhausted and dirty, and smiling. Every one of them smiling. And she had flagged it and included it in the report for Dravel without comment because she could not find the words to explain what struck her so deeply about it. It was not the smiling itself. Humans smiled often. She knew that. It was the context. Those soldiers had been through something terrible, were probably about to go through more of it, and they were smiling. Not because things were easy, because being in hard things together was something they understood, something they had made their peace with, something that did not break them the way it was supposed to. In the war room, Dravel had already read the first half of her report. He had stopped at the section on Special Forces selection and read it twice. Now he was standing at the head of the table, watching Aaron's team file into the room and take their seats. He looked at them the way Yeva had looked at that old photograph. Aaron met his eyes across the table and waited. Dravel said he understood they were being asked to look at a difficult situation. Aaron said that was fine. He said that was usually the kind they were called for. Dravel looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to the wall map, pulled up the Kelvrath corridor, and began the briefing. The humans leaned forward and listened. They did not look afraid. They did not look nervous. They looked, Dravel thought, exactly like people who had been waiting for this moment and were quietly glad it had arrived. He found that more reassuring than anything else in the room. The briefing lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, every alien general in the room had said something about the difficulty of the situation. At the Kelvrath corridor was deep inside contested space. The Dominion had positioned forces at every natural choke point. Their ground troops were enormous, heavy, armored, aggressive, and had never lost a surface engagement in the Dominion's recorded history. Their command structure was layered, redundant, and designed to keep functioning even when parts of it were destroyed. 2 conventional assaults had already failed. A third would likely produce the same result. Aaron listened to all of it and said very little. When the generals finished, he asked for the holomap to be left on. He stood up and walked around the table to look at it more closely. He studied it in silence for almost 2 minutes. The alien commanders waited. Dana watched Aaron from her seat and kept her expression neutral. Then Aaron asked 3 questions. But he asked where the Dominion's fuel was being stored. He asked where their senior commanders slept. He asked where in the entire corridor they believed they were completely safe from attack. Nobody had expected those questions. The Accord's intelligence officer, a thin, quick palindri named Sev, pulled up the relevant files and put the answers on the map. A fuel depot on a moon in the second system of the corridor. A command post in orbit above the 4th planet. a communications relay station that sat at the corridor's midpoint, deep enough inside Dominion-held space that no conventional force had ever come close to it. Aaron nodded slowly. He looked at Dana. She gave the smallest nod back. He turned to Dravel and said he would need his team to have full operational independence. No check-ins every 6 hours. No requirement to report position. No escort from the Accord fleet. The fleet could wait at the corridor's edge and be ready to move fast, but it needed to hold position until Aaron's team sent the word. Dravel asked how long he would need. Aaron said 3 days, maybe 4. The room went very quiet. 3 days to do what 2 full fleet assaults had failed to accomplish. Dravel looked around at the other commanders. Nobody spoke. He looked back at Aaron, standing in front of the map with his hands at his sides, calm and patient, waiting. Dravel said, "Approved." What happened over the next 72 hours was not recorded in full until much later, and even then, several sections of the operational report were classified. What is known is this. Aaron split his team into 3 groups. Dana took 8 people to the corridor's midpoint, the communications relay that the Dominion believed was untouchable. Pete Navarro took a group of 5 to the fuel depot on the moon in the second system. Aaron took the remaining 10 toward the command post. They did not use the corridor's main approach routes. They came in along the edges of the systems, using the natural debris fields and gas clouds as cover, moving in ships so small that the Dominion's long-range sensors registered them as background noise. They had been given every piece of intelligence the Accord had on Dominion sensor capabilities, and they had spent their transit time finding every gap. The moon where the fuel depot sat was cold and covered in low-gray rock. Pete's group landed 4 kilometers from the target and walked in. But they wore light suits, not the heavy environmental gear that most species needed in those conditions, but thin, flexible equipment that kept the worst of the cold out and left them able to move fast and quiet. Pete had trained in colder places. So had the others. They reached the depot perimeter in just over an hour. Pete spent 20 minutes watching the guard rotation. Then he moved. The fuel depot went offline 11 minutes later. At almost the same hour, Dana's team reached the communications relay. The relay was housed in a reinforced platform with automated defense systems and a garrison of 40 Dominion soldiers. Dana had reviewed the platform's layout during transit and identified 2 gaps in the automated coverage that existed because the platform's designers had assumed no hostile force could ever approach from that angle without being detected first. Dana's team came from that angle. The relay went dark 20 minutes after Pete's depot. The effect on the Dominion was immediate and visible from the edge of the corridor. Their fleet movements became disorganized. Ships that had been operating in tight, coordinated patterns began to spread out, trying to figure out what was happening. Command signals that should have gone through the relay were rerouted through backup channels, but the backup channels were slower and less secure, and the confusion showed. That was when Aaron moved on the command post. The post was in orbit, which meant the approach had to be fast and very precise. Aaron's group came in from below the orbital plane, using a dead satellite as a partial shield, and hit the post before the garrison had fully processed that the depot and relay were gone. The timing was the key. Not any single piece of the operation, but the overlap. 3 things happening so close together that the Dominion's response to one was interrupted by news of the next. The command post was taken offline. Several senior Dominion commanders were captured. The ones who were not captured had no way to talk to each other. Aaron sent a single short message to the Accord fleet. Move. Dravel received it 4 hours after the operation began. He looked at the timestamp and then looked at his second-in-command, a young Cathar officer named Vel. He said, "Begin the advance." The Accord fleet moved into the Kelvrath corridor and found it in chaos. Dominion ships that should have been coordinating their defense were scattered and confused. Ships that tried to regroup found their rally points already marked and under fire from the Accord's long-range guns. The Dominion's ground forces on Kelvrath 4, the corridor's most important planet, had no orbital support and no orders from above. That was where Dana's team went next. Kelvrath 4 was a dense, wet jungle planet, hot and thick with vegetation, the air full of spores and insects that were hostile to most biological life. The Accord's ground forces needed full environmental suits to operate on its surface. The suits were good but bulky, and they slowed movement and muffled senses. Dana's team used light filtration masks and kept moving at full speed. They did not go after the Dominion's main ground force. They went after the pieces that held it together, the power units for the forward defense lines, the vehicle fuel stations, the field command tents where the officers were trying to organize a response. They moved through the jungle fast and quiet, hitting targets and moving before the Dominion could organize a response, and every time the Dominion soldiers tried to rally at a designated point, that point was already being watched. Pete's group, working a different sector of the same planet, did the same thing. When the Accord's main ground forces landed 6 hours later, the battle they had prepared for was mostly finished. The Dominion's units were separated, confused, and running low on the things they needed to keep fighting. Some surrendered, and some tried to push through the jungle and find a way out. Most were contained. Dravel stood on the bridge of his command ship and watched the engagement reports come in. He watched the timestamps. He watched the Dominion's organized, experienced, historically undefeated ground force come apart in less than a day. Vel came to stand beside him and said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly that he did not understand how it was possible. Dravel thought about Yeva's report. He thought about the photograph of those soldiers smiling in the mud. He thought about Aaron's calm face in the war room, asking where the enemy thought they were safe. He said, "They do not fight the battle they are given. They fight the battle they choose." The corridor was secured by the end of the second day. It had taken the Accord's combined fleets 2 failed attempts. It had taken Aaron's team 71 hours. Somewhere on the surface of Kelvrath 4, Pete Navarro sat down against a tree, pulled a ration bar from his jacket, and ate it slowly while the jungle hummed and clicked around him. His suit reported that the air outside his mask contained 4 different compounds that would cause serious biological distress in most known species. He looked up at the canopy and thought that it reminded him a little of Louisiana in August. He finished the ration bar and got up. There was still work to do. News in the Galactic Accord moved fast, but the full story of the Kelvrath corridor moved faster than most. Within a week of the operation, every major military council in the known galaxy had received a copy of the engagement report. And within 2 weeks, most of them had read it twice. The questions being asked were not what anyone had expected. The initial reaction in many councils was skepticism. The report said a team of 24 humans had neutralized the Dominion's core infrastructure in under 12 hours, enabling a fleet operation that 2 previous assaults had failed to complete. Surely something was missing from the report. Surely there had been more support, more coordination, more assets involved. Surely 24 soldiers could not have done that. Then the full operational logs were released with timestamps, position data, and confirmed kill assessments from 3 independent Accord observers who had been on the fleet ships watching in real time. The skepticism went quiet. What replaced it was something harder to name. It was not quite fear, and though fear was part of it for some species, it was more like the feeling of standing next to something very large that you had not seen clearly until this moment, and realizing it had been standing there the whole time. Yeva received 17 separate requests for her original intelligence report in the week after Kelvrath. Defense analysts from the Palindri, the Drevath, the Sorel Collective, and 4 other civilizations all wanted the document she had put together. Some of them wanted the raw files underneath it, the original human military records. She sent what she could and noted in her log that the volume of requests was unlike anything she had seen in her career. She was sitting at her desk processing the 8th request when Roveth called. Roveth was a Palindri general, older, careful, highly decorated, and with a reputation for being cautious and thorough. He was not the kind of officer who acted on impulse or chased interesting things simply because they were interesting. When he called, it meant he had thought something through from several angles and arrived at a serious conclusion. He told Yeva he wanted to request a joint training exercise with a human special forces unit, not a combat operation, not a demonstration. An exercise where his soldiers would train alongside the humans and he could observe the methods directly. Yeva said she would pass the request to Aaron Gale. Roveth said he would appreciate that. Then he paused and asked her something she had not expected. He asked if she had formed any conclusions personally from reading the files. Not analysis, just a personal view. Yeva thought about it. And she thought about sitting in her office on that second day, staring at the wall. She thought about the photograph. She said that the thing she found hardest to understand was not the capability. It was the consistency. Other species had produced extraordinary soldiers, individuals who were exceptional, who could do things others could not. But what she kept finding in the human records was that these qualities were not exceptional in humans. They were normal. They were expected. The human military had built entire systems around finding people with these qualities and then making those qualities more reliable, not more rare. Roveth was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was exactly what he needed to see for himself. Aaron agreed to the exercise. He set it up on a remote moon 3 systems away from Varath Prime, and a place with rough terrain, unstable weather, and enough variety in its environment to make training genuinely challenging. He brought Dana, Pete, and 4 others from the original Kelvrath team, plus a dozen more from the wider unit who had not been in the corridor operation. Roveth brought 40 of his best soldiers, Palindri Special Operations troops, well-trained, experienced, physically capable. He also brought 6 observers from other species who had asked to watch. The exercise was simple in design. Aaron's team and Roveth's soldiers would run the same tasks side by side under the same conditions: navigation, load movement, problem-solving under pressure. No weapons, no combat. Just the base level of what selection looked like before the harder things began. On the first day, everything looked even. Both groups completed the navigation task within acceptable time. Roveth watched and noted the humans' movement patterns. They communicated less than his soldiers, but seemed to reach conclusions faster, as if certain things were simply understood without needing to be said. On the second day, they added load weight and removed 2 hours of rest from the cycle. Roveth's soldiers managed. The humans did not appear to notice. On the third day, they removed another 3 hours of rest and added a problem-solving component at the end of a long movement task. A logistics puzzle that had to be resolved under time pressure at the end of a 12-hour march before any rest was allowed. Roveth's soldiers completed the movement and then sat down to work on the puzzle. They were tired. Their coordination had slowed. 2 of the 40 made errors that they would not have made fresh. The humans completed the movement, worked the puzzle, and then one of them, a young man named Carter Walsh, 26 years old, the youngest person in the exercise, asked what the next task was before he had been told there was one. Roveth stood very still when he heard that. He walked over to where Carter was standing and asked him directly, was he not tired? Carter thought about it with the honest expression of someone who had not considered performing a different answer. He said yes, he was tired. His feet hurt, and he wanted coffee. But the exercise was not done, so what was the next task? Roveth had no answer to that. He looked at Carter for a long moment and then walked back to his observers without saying anything. That evening, he called Yeva again, and he said he understood now why she had gone quiet on the second day of reading. She asked what specifically had clarified it. He said it was not any one thing the humans had done. It was that they did not appear to experience the accumulation of difficulty the way his soldiers did. His soldiers got tired, and the tiredness built up, and eventually it changed how they thought and moved and made decisions. The humans got tired too. He could see it. It was real. But the tiredness did not seem to move inward the same way. It sat on top of them without sinking in. He said he did not have the biological framework to explain it. Yeva said she had found a note in one of the older human military psychology documents that used the phrase stress inoculation, the idea that if a person was exposed to enough difficulty in training over enough time, and the brain stopped treating difficulty as an emergency and started treating it as a condition. Not comfortable, but manageable. Expected. Roveth said that was a very unusual thing to build a military philosophy around. Yeva said that from what she had read, humans had not exactly built a philosophy around it. They had simply discovered over centuries of very hard experience that the people who survived worst conditions were the ones who could keep their minds working inside them, and so they had tried to make more people like that. The exercise continued for another week. By the end of it, Roveth's soldiers had deep respect for the humans they had trained alongside. A few genuine friendships had started. Pete Navarro had taught a palindry sergeant a card game from his home country and lost to him twice in a row, which he complained about loudly and cheerfully. Back at Verath Prime, a different kind of development was taking place. The Shreth Dominion had sent a message through a neutral intermediary. It was not a surrender. The Dominion did not use that language. It was framed as a request to adjust the terms of the current conflict, to establish a ceasefire and open a formal dialogue about the Kelvrath systems. The Accord's Diplomatic Council discussed the message for 2 days. Various interpretations were offered. Some thought it was a genuine opening, some thought it was a delay tactic. Aaron, when the council asked for his input, said he did not care either way from an operational standpoint. But he noted that the Dominion had never sent a message like this before in any conflict on record. That in every previous engagement they had been involved in, they had either won or retreated. They had never asked to talk. Someone on the council asked what Aaron thought had changed. He said he thought the Dominion had done what Roveth had done and what Dravel had done. He thought they had looked at what had happened in the corridor and done the math. Dana, sitting beside him, kept her expression steady. But later, walking back through the station's long corridors toward their quarters, she said quietly that she found it strange to be feared by something that large. Aaron said he understood. He said it was worth remembering that being feared and being respected were not always the same thing, and what they were really after was the second one. Dana thought about that. She said she thought they might be getting both, and Aaron said that was probably fine for now. The formal session was held 3 months after the Kelvrath operation. It was called the Accord Defense Restructuring Summit, and it was the most attended meeting in the station's recent history. Every member civilization sent its highest-ranking military representative. The chamber on Level 1, the largest in the station, with tiered seating for over 300 delegates and translation arrays running in 47 languages simultaneously, was full for the first time in decades. The session was meant to produce a new shared military doctrine. The old one had been written 400 years ago, built around the capabilities of the species that existed in the Accord at the time. A lot had changed since then. Most significantly, in the past 3 months, everything that every military council in the galaxy thought it knew about what a small unit of soldiers could accomplish had been quietly revised. Dravel chaired the session. He opened it with a brief account of the Kelvrath operation, presented without drama, just the facts and the timeline. When he finished, the chamber was quiet in the way large rooms get quiet when the people inside them are thinking hard. Then he invited Aaron Gale to speak. Aaron had not prepared a speech in the formal sense. He had written a few notes on a small piece of paper during the transport to the station that morning, looked at them once, and put them in his pocket. He did not take them out again. He walked to the podium in his service uniform, plain and dark, no medals displayed, and stood for a moment looking out at 300 beings representing civilizations that had been traveling the stars since before his ancestors had iron. He said he wanted to start with something honest. He said humans did not think of themselves as the best soldiers in the galaxy. He was not standing at the podium to tell the Accord that humanity was superior or more capable or more valuable than any other species. That was not what he believed, and it was not what the record showed if you read it carefully. What the record showed was that humans were very hard to stop. That was a different thing. He said that for most of human history, the long, hard stretch of it before they ever reached the stars, they had been a small, fragile species on a single, unremarkable planet, and constantly fighting against things bigger and stronger than themselves, the climate, disease, predators, each other. They had lost those fights more times than could be counted. They had been wiped out in places, pushed to the edge, reduced to small groups surviving in conditions that should have finished them. But they had not been finished. He said that the thing humans had developed, the thing that explained Kelvrath and the selection process, and the 2 days that Yeva had spent reading military files in silence, was not a weapon or a technique. It was a relationship with difficulty, a long, deeply practiced ability to look at a bad situation and not see the end of the road, to see instead the next step, and then the one after that, and to keep seeing the next step for as long as it took, regardless of how tired or hurt or outnumbered they were. He said this was not a comfortable thing to have built into a species. He said it had caused humans enormous suffering throughout their history because a species that finds it hard to stop also finds it hard to know when stopping is the right answer. They had wars that lasted too long because neither side could bring themselves to end it. They had people who pushed past limits that should have been respected. The same quality that made them useful in the Kelvrath corridor had also, across the centuries, made them dangerous to each other. He said he was not standing there pretending that history away. It was part of who humans were, and he thought the Accord deserved an honest account of it. But he also said this: every hard thing humanity had been through had taught them something. The long wars had taught them what war cost. The suffering had made them better at recognizing it in others. The centuries of learning to survive had produced, eventually, the capacity to protect. Not just themselves, but whatever was beside them. He said that was what humanity was offering the Accord. Not invincibility, not the promise that nothing would go wrong. Just the unconditional intention to show up, to keep going, and to bring everyone they could back with them. He stopped. He looked out at the chamber. He said he hoped that was worth something. The room held its silence for a long moment after he stepped back from the podium. Then Dravel stood. He had not planned to. Then he was the chair of the session, and the chair did not typically stand as a gesture of personal response during formal proceedings. It was not protocol. But he stood, and once he did, the delegate beside him stood, and then the row behind, and then the row behind that, and within 30 seconds the entire chamber was on its feet. Aaron stood at the podium and watched it happen. His face stayed still, but those who were close enough could see that he took a slow, careful breath and held it for a moment before letting it go. Dana was seated in the observer section at the side of the chamber. She watched the room stand and felt something move through her that she could not immediately name. Pride was part of it. So was something older and quieter. The feeling of having carried a weight for a long time and having someone else finally see how heavy it was. Pete was beside her. He was looking at the floor, which he did sometimes when things hit him harder than he expected. His jaw was set and his eyes were bright. After the session, when the formal proceedings had moved on to the structural work of rewriting the doctrine, Aaron found his way to the observation deck on the station's upper level. It was a long, curving room with wide windows that looked out at open space, stars in every direction, unhurried and permanent. Dana found him there a while later. Then Pete, then Carter Walsh, still the youngest, who leaned against the window frame with his coffee and looked out at the stars with the quiet expression of someone who was thinking something through. They stood together without talking for a while. Outside, a Kethar patrol ship moved slowly past, its running lights blinking in the dark. Somewhere behind them, through the station's walls, 300 delegates were working out the details of a new way of doing things. A new shared understanding of what it meant to be defended and by whom. Pete said, without looking away from the stars, that he still could not quite believe it had gone the way it did. Dana asked what he meant. He said he meant all of it, the accord, the briefing room, Dravel standing up first. He said he had spent most of his career doing work that nobody talked about, in places nobody could name, and the idea that the entire known galaxy had just spent 3 months reading about it was hard to hold in his head. Carter said quietly that he thought that was the point, maybe. That they had never done it for the attention. That was exactly why it meant something now. Aaron said nothing. He was looking out at the stars the same way he always looked at things. Slowly, without urgency, taking in the whole picture before settling on any part of it. He was thinking about what he had said at the podium. He was thinking about whether he had said it right. Not the words exactly, but the intention underneath them. He hoped the galaxy had understood what he was trying to tell them. Not that humans were fearless. They were not. Every person in this room had been afraid at some point during the Kelvrath operation. And every person in this room had known the weight of a hard thing and felt it clearly. The difference was not the absence of fear. It was what they did with it. They had learned over centuries and generations of very hard experience to keep moving anyway, to take the fear and the pain and the exhaustion and fold it into the work instead of setting the work down because of it. That was not a gift. It was not something they were born with. It was something their history had pressed into them the hard way. He hoped that was worth something to the galaxy. He thought it was. Outside, the stars held steady in the dark. The station hummed quietly around them. Somewhere in the Kelvrath corridor, the first Accord supply ships were already moving through. The route open again, the work done. Dana finished her coffee, and she looked at Aaron and said, "What do you think comes next?" Aaron looked out at the stars for a moment longer. Then he said, "Something harder. It always is." Pete smiled. Carter smiled. Dana looked at the stars and felt that quiet thing again. Not quite pride, not quite peace, but somewhere between the two. Something that felt, in its own way, like belonging. They stood there together for a while longer, 4 people from one small planet, looking out at everything that was left to do. They were not afraid of it. They never really had been.